Another edition of the Mormon Expositor podcast. We are here finally to wrap up the Mark Hofmann Who Is series. This is episode 3, and much like the Star Wars movies, where you had to wait 3 years in between episodes, you had several months in between episode 2 and episode 3. But we hope that it will be worth it. So we have here the same cast of the 2 prior episodes. So we have Clay. How's it going tonight, Clay?
It's good. I'm excited.
Good. Yeah. And we have Amy. How's it going, Amy?
It's good. How are you guys doing tonight?
Good. Out there in the land of enchantment.
Yeah, in fact, the land enchanted us on Sunday when we were supposed to record, and we got slammed with an enormous summer monsoon that knocked our power out for like 3 hours. So it was quite enchanting.
No, I didn't know it even rained out there in the desert.
Oh my gosh. Like at about 5 or 6 o'clock, clouds start rolling in, and then maybe 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes more, about 7 o'clock at night, it gets super dark clouds, lots of lightning, lots of thunder, cool breezes roll in, big purple clouds, and then summer storm, and it's amazing. But This time it knocked out the power.
Well, and I'm Troy. I forgot to introduce myself. Yeah, Troy, it's me. And I'm coming to you live from Washington, D.C., where the heat index was 107 today. Ooh. So that was exciting. But Clay's down in Arizona, and he thinks 107 is kind of like a normal spring day, so I shouldn't complain about 107.
No, 107's hot. Up in Tucson, it doesn't get much higher than that every once in a while, but 107's hot.
Yeah, it was warm. It was warm out there today. Plus, we have the humidity here too. Well, let's jump right in so we can, because we have promised we are wrapping this up. This is the last episode, and so we don't take 2 hours. We'll hopefully we'll take less than that. But we want to get right in here. Now, you'll remember that we left off after Hofmann had he'd sold the Salamander Letter and the Josiah Stowell Letter to the church. The last episode had a reading of those, done by me, I believe. Yes. And, yes. And the Salamander Letter, well, both letters had become public. The Josiah Stowell Letter, it was public, but I think a very select few knew about it or cared about it. But as we discussed last time, Salamander Letter was pretty big news. They ended up publishing it in the church news, and a lot of Mormon historians and leaders, including Elder Oaks, were trying to explain the implications of the Salamander Letter. So,
which was that it did not contradict what we understand or could come to understand about Mormon doctrine. Oaks's position was that this fits right in line with what we've always known. Yes,
that's what he said. So after those things sort of started to go off the rails for good old Mark Hofmann. Now, before we get into the story, one of the things that I wondered about, and I think I mentioned it on the last episode, is I thought Hofmann had a pretty good gig up until this point, and that is he had kind of a built-in mark. What I mean by mark is, like, if you're a con man, the people that you're conning and taking money from are a mark. He had more than one. He had the church, and he had all of the rare Mormon document collectors kind of along the Wasatch Front, and even more, I guess even into the Zion corridor down in Arizona, some in Idaho, that he could sell forgeries to. He was selling them piecemeal, had plenty of time to make them, and he was making a lot of money. Well, I guess he got greedy. I'm not quite sure what happened, but his next scheme was to come up with this thing called the McClellan Collection. Now, Clay, do you want to tell us what the McClellan Collection, I guess, was supposed to be?
Yeah, absolutely. So McClellan, he was a member of the original Quorum of the 12 back in the day, and this was supposed to be three huge boxes of materials that included journals from McClellan, and also, so McClellan left the church and got excommunicated in 1838, right after the Kirtland Bank, fiasco, and there was a lot of disillusionment there. And he became a vocal opponent of the church after his excommunication. So it was supposed to have his journals. It was also supposed to have an original piece of facsimile 2, the papyrus from the Pearl of Great Price. And then it was also supposed to have an affidavit from Emma Smith that claimed that the first visionary experience that Joseph had was in relation to the Book of Mormon, and not the first vision experience that most of the mainstream LDS people now know. Something that I found interesting about that is that that's actually the account that Lucy Mack Smith gives in her book, the unedited and unadulterated version that was later kind of, taken apart by Brigham Young and others. But she said that the first experience that Joseph Smith had as a vision was with the angel Moroni in the Book of Mormon. So, but anyway, again, it was supposed to have one of those documents, and then it was also supposed to have a document that said that Joseph Smith was going to sell the copyright of the Book of Mormon to raise money for the church.
But Clay, let me ask a question. When you say, was it the fact that the document was there, or was it this alleged document talking about selling the copyright, or was that the first time that this had been really mentioned? Because I can't remember the guy's name. Was it Martin Harris told him to go to Canada to sell the copyright, and then that was the revelation that sometimes comes from Satan because it didn't work out?
Yeah, in the one of the original, I don't know that it ever actually made one of the original versions of the Doctrine and Covenants, but it is one of the Joseph Smith revelations. It was actually, the Lord told Joseph Smith to go to Canada and sell the copyright to make money. Yeah. And that
was supposed to be this document confirming that happened?
Yeah, I think it carries along the same trend with a lot of these things are not outliers. I mean, they fit in with, things that we know about church history. I mean, for example, the Emma Smith affidavit that says that his first experience was in regards to the Book of Mormon. Again, we already have mention of that by Lucy Mack Smith, but then you kind of solidify this with some signed document that makes it more real and more difficult for the church to sidestep, is my perspective on what he was doing. But obviously three crates of forged documents, that's a huge undertaking.
Right. And some of the things that he was going to include, including the so-called original facsimile 2 papyrus, that was kind of way beyond what he'd done before. It would involve not just printing, but he'd have to recreate the hieroglyphics or whatever they are in the facsimile. And then obviously a papyrus piece from ancient Egypt is going to look a lot older than some document from the 19th century. So he was going to have to do whatever to age that further. But the bottom line on there's two bottom lines. Can there be two bottom lines?
Sure.
Probably not.
There might be three, because I have a question.
Okay, well, maybe the three key points of the McClellan collection for me, I'll mention the two, and then Amy, you can ask your question. But one is that it was supposed to contain a bunch of stuff damaging to the church. And so Hofmann was sort of continuing his theme of the Salamander letter and the Josiah Stowell letter of, using his credibility as, I can find all these rare documents and they're all authentic and all of your historians have authenticated everything I found. They're even authenticating stuff that is not entirely consistent with the origin stories that you're telling everybody. And now I've got not just a couple documents, I've got 3 crates of this stuff. So that's one kind of, the reason that we'll get into. The church was very, very interested in acquiring this McClellan collection. And then 2, I always have to keep in mind that McClellan collection, there actually is a McClellan collection that Salt Lake had the entire time in its vault.
That was my question.
Yeah.
That was my bottom line. Like, come on, wasn't also part of the problem they already had it?
Yeah, well, they had a McClellan collection And you often hear, when you hear people talking about the Hofmann affair, and especially if they want to be critical of the church, and not that the church doesn't deserve some criticism with respect to the Hofmann affair, but they always say, and by the way, the church had the McClellan collection in its vault the whole time. Well, they had a McClellan collection that was documents, diaries, and stuff by this William McClellan, but I don't think they ever thought they had this thing that Hofmann was selling them, because he was telling them it had all these golden nuggets that Clay's just mentioned. And there's another one that I just remembered. He also said that in there was supposed to be a land deed that was signed by Solomon Spaulding and Sidney Rigdon. And I think that the land was for somewhere near Palmyra. And that was trying to tie together this idea that Rigdon and Joseph Smith worked with Solomon Spaulding to plagiarize his manuscript and create the Book of Mormon. But anyway, he actually had none of this stuff. It was all his imagination saying, well, I've got all this stuff. It's a big collection, and church, this is very interesting, and you should really buy it because it's going to damage the church if another collector acquires this who isn't friendly to the church and lets this out. And I think he was even threatening that he'd heard that there was a interested buyer who was some kind of evangelical minister from Texas or something.
Yeah,
he was saying.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say.
The collection was supposed to come from some Texas owner, right? And
yeah.
As well. And yeah, you're right. He was trying to create these forgeries on the fly as he was creating the story on what they held. I think a point that we need to keep in mind as well is, you were talking about how Hofmann gets himself in hot water. In my very non-psychologically trained mind, I think two things are driving this. One is that, we can see that in the book that Hofmann has this huge ego, that he's untouchable. He's going to outdo himself with each one of these forgeries. But then also Hoffman's lifestyle begins to get more and more expensive. Him and his wife buy this large house, and he's buying cars, and he's going on these trips to New York, and hanging out in strip clubs, and partying through the night. It's not cheap, and so he's trying to get these big collections together.
Right, and I'm sure we all can agree that he bit off he bit off way more than he could chew with this McClellan collection.
Yeah.
Because, again, it was all in his imagination. I think he actually produced that land deed that I was talking about, but that's about it. It was all talk, and because he was doing all these other things, he didn't, and he also at this time, it's kind of a side note, was doing a bunch of forgeries involving general American documents and selling those. And that's one of the reasons that he continued to go to New York, is he was selling them to collectors and auction houses in New York. And he just didn't have time to hunker down in the basement and produce 4 big boxes of forged documents. So we have this McClellan collection that Clay talked about, and we knew, or we just talked about how, at least Hofmann was telling a bunch of people that this thing could be damaging to the church if it ever was made public. Amy, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of some of his dealings with the church with respect to the McClellan collection? See, you can tell I'm a lawyer because I say with respect to. It's burned into my brain. I've got to stop saying that in normal English usage. But talk about his dealings with the church, about the McClellan collection, and let's take it to that point.
All right. As always, Hofmann had ingratiated himself with many members of the church hierarchy as far as general authorities, Quorum of the 70, and when Hofmann, he'd already had dealings with Steve Christensen with the Salamander Letter. Steve Christensen had purchased it and then had gifted it to the church. And when the McClellan collection came about, he and Christensen went to Hugh Pinnock, member of the Quorum of the 70, and Hugh Pinnock had been personally appointed by then, I guess he wouldn't be President Hinckley at that time, but he wasn't in the quorum. He was a 70, right?
No, Hinckley or Pinnock?
At that time, Hinckley.
He was effectively running the church, so I think he at that time was the first counselor in the first presidency, but those of us who are old geezers will remember that when President Kimball was president of the church, he got really sick, and that his two counselors were N. Eldon Tanner and Marion G. Romney, and they were both old. And so the whole first presidency was essentially bedridden and unable to really run the church. And so they called Gordon B. Hinckley to be the third counselor in the first presidency.
And he was already the part of the public relations. I mean, he was that guy. And so this was a really easy position for him to step into as far as dealing with people and coordinating things and negotiating and making sure that the best face was always forward and how to squash things and those kinds of issues. And so Hinckley basically put Hugh Pinnock in charge of dealing with Hofmann. Part of what was to his benefit with keeping the church at bay and producing the collection was one of the forgeries that Hofmann had put together was Oath of a Freeman, which many people may remember that is the first printed press document in the United States. And he had forged it. And I believe, didn't he actually forge 2 copies?
Yeah.
He's brilliant, right? So Library of Congress has one of his copies of Oath of a Freeman, and they're doing their whole forgery detective work to make sure it's legit. And if memory serves me, they were either going to buy it for $1 or $2 million.
Yeah, so Oath of a Freeman, we might as well, I think we can go into a little bit more detail on that, because this is part of what helped catch, at the end of the day, this was some of the evidence against him. So
should we talk about the loan that the bank or that the church leverages? Or
yeah, go for it.
Like Amy said, him and Christensen are dealing with Pinnock. They're saying, hey, we've got this McClellan collection. Pinnock says, hey, well, the church is interested, but we don't want to look like we've bought it. And so what was going to happen is Christensen was going to buy it and donate it to the church, but supposedly Hofmann needed money to buy it from this ghost Texas document dealer, a collector who had it.
And his excuse was that he was waiting for the Library of Congress to pay him for Oath of a Freeman.
Yeah, that's why he didn't have money. You're right, Amy. And so Pinnock calls Elder Oaks and says, hey, do we want this? Do I have permission to leverage a bank loan? Oak says yes, as long as they can't trace this to us, essentially. So Pinnock calls up First Interstate Bank. He tries Zion's Bank first, but couldn't get anybody on the line. Calls First Interstate Bank and leverages a $185,000 loan with no collateral. I haven't borrowed tons of money from the bank, but normally you've got to put up some collateral or some kind of contract deal. And essentially, it was like, okay, come by, pick up the $185,000 and promise you're going to pay us back in a week or so.
Yeah, now, and also, Pinnock was on the board of directors of First Interstate Bank. This was not standard operating procedure. It was like you say, Clay. It was what they call a signature loan. You're getting a loan, and the only security that the bank has is basically you. And so signature loans are not that uncommon, depending on someone's credit rating or if the bank knows that they have readily available assets that they could turn around and pay the loan on demand. And so Pinnock leveraged his position as a member of the board of directors and frankly as a general authority, because he did say this was for the church and that Elder Oaks had approved this. Whoever it was at First Interstate Bank said, oh, well, I guess if the church needs the money, they're good for it.
Which is so bizarre to me, because does the church need the money? When you look at it, you know what I mean? The idea that there was even a loan made, that this was even orchestrated, seems to me to also be one of those really like a misstep as far as the church is concerned. I mean, obviously, no one thought this was going to get out and everything was going to be hush-hush, but to even involve an outside party to secure a loan, that just seems absolutely stupid to me, to create a paper trail like that.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of people started making less than smart decisions here. And so you had a lot of factors going. You had, from the church's side, one, if you believe the books that we've read on this, church was nervous about what was in the McClellan collection. They'd already been burned a couple times on stuff Hofmann had found and sold them. So the prospect of having 3 boxes of Salamander letters open to public view. They weren't all that hip on that idea. So they really, really wanted this. But like Clay said, they didn't want to buy it directly. To the extent they were going to say anything about this at all, they wanted to say that it had been donated to them or that they'd acquired these important historical documents, and we're going to have them evaluated and then put in that storage room where the Ark of the Covenant got put in at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so they had that going, and so the loan was a loan to Hofmann that was guaranteed by Pinnock's signature. Like I think Clay said that the purpose of the loan is Hofmann was telling not only the church, but he was telling a whole bunch of people, I need money to go buy the McClellan collection. It's going to cost $180-something thousand, close to $200,000. I do not have that kind of money. I'm waiting for this Oath of the Freeman thing to sell, and it's going to take a long time for the Library of Congress to authenticate this and for that sale to close. And so I need to borrow money from you to go buy the collection. Then I can turn around and sell it, and you can either be repaid or you'll make money. And so that's what was going on with the First Interstate Bank loan. And I think Pinnock, again, if you believe what it says in these books, I don't know Hugh Pinnock. I've never met him, so I'm not saying this is firsthand knowledge. I'm just quoting or paraphrasing what's in this Salamander book. They interviewed one of his University of Utah fraternity brothers, and whoever they talked to remembers Pinnock in college saying that I either want to be president of the United States or president of the church.
Wow.
And so he was a very ambitious guy, and he was probably on his way up in church leadership and had his office next to Dallin Oaks. And so I think he really wanted to show Oaks and the other church leaders that, hey, I can get this done. That this McClellan thing, we know that we want it. I think he just sort of dug himself in so far that he wasn't really thinking all that clearly as probably not the best idea that I just go sign for $185,000, which is probably worth 300-something thousand today, and just kind of hope this all works out.
Well, Christensen was pretty upset about it himself. I mean, even though he was what we would call a liberal Mormon, he was not pleased to see the shadiness of it all go down. He had encountered some of these situations previously, even in his fringeness. He would see things that were going on based on his interactions with Hofmann and Hinckley and a couple others that I think probably was kind of, pulling back the curtain a little bit. And he was really, I think, very disillusioned and confused.
Yeah, he was conflicted. I mean, he says, and his quote is, this form of dialogue walks the fine line of honest intent. So, and he was talking about, the Temple Recommend interview. This is beyond the scope of this podcast, but just to take a stab a little bit, it makes me wonder, you were talking, Troy, about how people were making bad decisions, and maybe Pinnock thought maybe he didn't realize. Why didn't he realize that this was a bad idea? But us as the public, we only know bad deals that get caught and tied up in news stories. I mean, it really makes me wonder how many shady deals go on and have gone on and continue to go on that are a little bit more tightened up and less messy, but just go on without us knowing, which is an unanswerable question. But I think it's naive of us to think that these are the only shady deals that the corporation of, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has made.
I would agree.
I don't think I'll disagree. I think that's probably true of just about any large organization.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and I'm not singling them out, and we'll talk about that later. But
why don't you talk about how it wasn't just the church that Hofmann had offered the McClellan deal to and borrowed money for and promised to deliver. He had other buyers. You want to talk about that a little bit?
You and Amy will have to take it over. I'm shady on this. I don't.
So Al Rust, who's alive and well, I don't know him, but maybe he's listening to the podcast. If we're telling this wrong, Al, then send us a comment. MormonExpositor.com. So he's a rare coin and some document dealer who's in Salt Lake. He specializes in selling early Mormon currency and early Utah currency and other early and rare coins. And so Hofmann had also approached Rust about buying the McClellan collection.
He had a history of dealing with Rust. He was doing the shady rob Paul to pay Peter stuff with him his entire professional relationship, and he would find something rare and Al would pay a huge amount of money for it. And then like a week later, he'd find another one and Al would be like, okay, well, I guess I'll buy this one. And then, 2 weeks later, he'd have another one. It's like, what the hell, man? You keep telling me these things are rare and I'm paying all this great money for it, but you keep producing more. And so he had a love-hate with Hofmann, but he was also really, because of the nature of the business, he was caught up in the mystery and the excitement of the find, but he definitely had a love-hate with Hofmann. Hofmann owed him a lot of money back and forth. Sometimes he'd pay him when he said he was, he didn't. And when he did, he would only pay him back partial with cash. And then, oh, well, the other half, when I was out doing this, I was out traveling in New York, I picked this up. So the other half of your money is tied up in this. And when I get it, you're going to get 3 times the amount. He was doing this to everybody.
And I recall he talked a lot about the McClellan collection to other people, and he did talk to Al Rust, but it was my impression that he was selling the collection to the church, but then he also offered other people like single documents from those 3 crates of documents or something like that.
Yeah, he was definitely doing that. He was trying to sell pieces of it, or sell the collection piecemeal, I guess is a better way to say it. But again, Al Rust, if you're listening, or if you know Al Rust and we've got this wrong, let us know. But I think he actually offered the collection to Al Rust, and it was once where you go down to Texas and get this thing. I need some money to buy it, and so Rust, I think, had loaned him $160,000 or $180,000 to go buy the collection. And then Rust kept asking, well, where's my money? Where's the McClellan collection? And Hofmann at one point said, well, President Hinckley has it. It's the church. The church bought it, but I can't repay you. Yeah, I can't repay you what you loaned me to acquire it. It turned out that the deal didn't work out for you. I didn't get it for you. The church bought it, but because all of your money's tied up in all of my other investments, like Amy was talking about, none of which were real. Al, sorry, your money is stuck in the G string of 400 strippers in New York. So he told Al Rust, the church has the McClellan collection. I'm sorry. And then Al Rust at this point was very fed up, and so he wrote a letter to President Hinckley saying, I loaned Hofmann a substantial sum of money, like I think it was around $180,000, to purchase this McClellan collection for me. He says that you have it, which is fine. The church should have it, and I was considering donating it to the church anyway or some such, but I just wanted you to know that he was double dealing. And so that came out later during the investigation, and even in, we'll get to this in a minute, but even in the interviews that the police and the press conference that the church had, there was mention of this letter that Rust had sent to Hinckley explaining what had gone on, and Hinckley had advised Hofmann that he needed to repay Al Rust. It was news to Hinckley that Rust thought he had the McClellan collection because, of course, no one had the McClellan collection because it didn't exist. But Clay, maybe just talk about some of these other investors that Hofmann was kind of yanking around, and talk about how before the bombs went off, literally, kind of how much money he owed to different people. And
yeah, so pressure's building here. Hoffman's got all these deals going. He's borrowed money from a lot of people. Whenever he does get money, he immediately, use that to pay off loans instead of buy the things that he says he's supposed to be buying. And the big thing is this Oath of the Free Man. The Library of Congress is supposed to buy it for $1 million or more than $1 million, like Amy said. And they're starting to backpedal a little bit or delay a little bit. He owes $185,000 to the First Interstate Bank, and he can't get that because the Library of Congress isn't paying him for the Oath of the Free Man. He owes money or investors that had invested in the Oath of the Free Man. Through a series of deals, Hofmann gains the trust of this guy named Thomas Wilding, and Thomas Wilding invests in a Charles Dickens book called The Haunted Man, and he gives Hofmann $160,000. And he also gave him later on $22,000 or $23,000 for a Brigham Young collection. And then for the Oath of the Free Man, he gathers a bunch of investors as well and gives Hofmann, like $170,000. And so in total, while he's trying to pay off his bank loan and pay off Rust and pay off all these other people, he owes Wilding and others almost $500,000. He just owes tons of money.
Not to mention that he's just bought a house over in Holiday, which at the time I think was about $175,000. I think it was like a 6-bedroom home, which today would easily be a $500,000 home.
Yeah,
And he
yeah.
doesn't have the money to put down on it. He's trying to levy his reputation in church circles and in the rare document circles to kind of get this house moving in with no money down. His wife is kind of scrambling and dealing with these people and trying to get this house, and he owed well over $500,000 in monies to numerous people.
And then he still doesn't have the forgeries of the McClellan collection to sell to the church or to Christensen. So, I mean, he's sunk. He has no forgeries to sell, and he's owing just a shit ton of money.
He's not answering the phone. He's not showing up to appointments when he's supposed to show up to appointments. He's flying all over the United States on these supposed wild goose chases, or at least telling people, oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't make that appointment. I got a last minute phone call and had to fly to New York, and that's where I am. And he was literally running all over the country, avoiding people because he didn't know what was going to happen. He didn't know what to do.
I think this is a good time to briefly revisit Oath of a Free Man. So Amy explained what it was. And so Hofmann forged the Oath of a Free Man, and it's not a holograph, which is, I think I mentioned in one of the earlier episodes, the legal term for a handwritten signed document. It's printed with a plate, a printing plate. And he made a couple of those, but he tried to sell the first one to the Library of Congress. And the Library of Congress initially was quite excited about this. And yes, they had quoted him a price of anywhere from $1 to $2 million, depending on authenticity and conditions and stuff. And while all this stuff was going on with the McClellan collection and all the mess with all these other investors, he finally heard back from the Library of Congress that, well, we're still trying to authenticate it, and it's still going through all of our testing and stuff, but the most we're going to be able to give you for it at this time is $30,000. And that, when you owe $700,000 or more to people, $30,000 doesn't really help you.
No, that's only one really good night with a stripper.
So I think that before he killed people, he was hoping or planning on the Oath of a Free Man thing to come through, which would have bought him more time to forge the McClellan collection, because if he had a payday of $1 million, although he didn't factor withholding in because he would only have received about $700,000. I think rates were actually higher then, so he probably would have only received about $600,000.
Hey, Troy, are you a tax lawyer?
Yes. See, I can't function. I can't even read a crime book without thinking about the tax implications. I'm a sick man.
Yeah, I mean, but it's true. Had he even sold the Oath of the Free Man, he still would have been in debt. He wouldn't have been in the clear.
Yeah, I think in his mind, though, he was thinking...
He was probably thinking, I've got to come up with the first 116 pages next, because that's... And definitely, I mean, if you think about it, this, as much of a good gig as he had going on, he was really showing his hand in so far as there's only so many rumored, mythic Mormon documents that would be valuable enough to have, that people know enough about to want to scoop up. And really, at this point, what else is left besides the 116 pages?
Yeah, I think he told someone maybe at his parole hearing or something that ultimately was his goal. Mm-hmm. That he was going to do the 116 pages, but that never happened. So this McClellan deal with Christensen and Pinnock and, the church was supposed to close on October 15th in Steve Christensen's office in the Judge Building. And that is the day that the bombs literally blew up. We started episode 1 kind of as... Here's what happened. The bombs blew up. And now we know that he put a bomb in front of Christensen's office in the Judge Building that was full of concrete nails, and it killed him. He also put a bomb in front of Kathy Sheets's house, and it killed her. So things were kind of pandemonium.
Probably
in Salt
intended
Lake.
For her husband initially, but
right, her husband Gary
Sheets,
because the idea was to throw the police off, to make them think that Christensen's death was related to
business deals and their own private
the CFS stuff.
Yeah, the CFS financial problems that we talked about on the first episode. So that all happened, and Salt Lake City police were now scrambling to figure out what was going on. You can imagine not a lot of bombs go off in Salt Lake City on a regular basis. And so it's all over the news. But
it was being called the Beirut of the West. This whole incident was big frickin' deal, and it was national coverage. And I believe it was, oh gosh, I want to say Time Magazine had published an article right afterwards and said, this is essentially the Beirut of the West, what we're dealing with here.
So it was a bad deal. So let's talk about the investigation now and kind of how Hofmann was caught.
The third bomb. Are we going to talk about that? I didn't mean to cut you. So then a bomb goes off in Hoffman's car.
The next day.
Yes. No, it was the same day, wasn't it?
No, it was the next day.
Okay.
Yeah, the 5th.
All right, I'll shut up. You go into your thing, but...
Well, he had parked his car, I believe it was facing south on State Street, right next to the Deseret Gym, which is now one of the auxiliary parking lots for the conference center. And witnesses say that they saw this guy pull up, get out of the car. I don't know if he went somewhere and came back to his car, but then he came around the passenger side, opened the front door, or opened the front passenger's door, reached into his car, something on the front seat, and that's when the bomb went off. And Hofmann's story was that when he returned to his car, I think is that he saw something on the floorboard of his car, and he went to go reach for it, and it went off. But what they discovered was the way that bomb was set off is that there was no way that if it was sitting on the floorboard of the car that it would have gone off without him moving it in a specific way. And so they realized that there was no way, based on his story and what people had seen, that this bomb was anything other than something he planted and he detonated himself. And like Troy said at the very beginning, it was very suspicious from moment one. And people who were on the scene pretty much immediately knew, based on his injuries and he had some serious injuries. And then I think, like Clay said, his balls were seriously injured. He had some hand problems.
That's not a good combination.
No,
I know, isn't it?
He blew his leg up and he blew his balls up, I think, is essentially what happened.
Yeah, so let's rewind for just a second and talk about the bombing at the Judge Building, because Clay wants to talk about something that happened while the police were kind of walking around and seeing what was going on there. I know what you're referring to, Clay, and it is interesting, so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about how the church deals with the police station and the prosecutor's office and all that, and how they just cooperate or don't cooperate with the investigation. But my favorite part is that this bomb goes off in the Judge Building. Christensen's dead. It's the same morning that this deal was supposed to go down with the McClellan collection. The investigators show up on the scene, and then 2 church security guards show up, and they say, hey, we got files on both Hofmann and Christensen. Would you like those? The investigators were like, what the hell? They didn't even know that Christensen was the guy that was dead yet. And they say, I guess if you think it will help us in our investigation, then sure. Later, they find out who was involved, who died, and they call and say, hey, how about sending those files over to us that you told us about? And the church said, we don't know what you're talking about. So, that's just kind of a beautiful example of like the bizarrety of how intimately they were involved and how well connected they were with everything, yet how unwilling they were to cooperate, I guess.
Yeah, I wanted to talk just real quick about the bomb that went off in Hoffmann's car, and then let's move to the church's response to the investigation, because I think that's probably the most interesting part of this, the whole thing, really. Yeah, so Amy is right. The eyewitnesses saw Hofmann open his car door, reach in, and then things exploded. Hofmann's testimony was that I can't remember if it was either on the floorboard or on the front seat, but he said he opened his door, the bomb fell on the ground next to the car, and that is where it exploded. Because these were bombs, they actually brought some ATF guys in to investigate the bomb scenes, and they interviewed Hofmann in the hospital shortly after the bomb went off in his car. And everybody at this time, remember, is assuming that Hofmann is another victim. Nobody thinks that he's
No, they thought this was people who are anti-Mormons or just general enemies of the church are trying to suppress the truthfulness of what this Hofmann character was bringing out. And, he was trying to paint himself as a victim of those who would suppress the truth.
Right. So the investigators go interview him in the hospital, and he gives them the story that we just said. Oh, it fell on the ground, and the ATF guy was talking to the guys who had interviewed Hofmann that day, the day that the bomb went off in Hoffman's car, and he said, "Well, what did this guy tell you?" And now, Grant, I've got to back up and say the ATF guy had done a thorough investigation of the bomb scene in the car, and even though it was 1985, they were still pretty accurate. Based on where the shrapnel and stuff from the bomb flew, they could tell where the explosion, where the detonation took place, and how the shrapnel and debris spread. And anyway, so the guy said, the ATF guy said, "What did he tell you about the bomb?" And he said, "Oh, it fell out of his car, off his car, hit the ground outside his car and exploded." And the ATF guy said, "That did not happen. That is your bomber." Because he explained, "I investigated the scene. The bomb went off in between the two seats at about seat level. The blast went kind of at an angle down towards the floor of the passenger side and then back towards the back seat of the driver's side." And he mapped it all out. And he said, if he's telling you something different, then he's the bomber, and it's fairly frequent that bombers can blow themselves up inadvertently because they're not skilled in handling bombs properly. So they knew pretty much from the day after Christensen and Sheets were killed that Hofmann was their guy.
Now, it should be mentioned that, and those of you who are in the great state of Utah, especially if you live in Salt Lake or Utah County, you are familiar with the name Ron Yangich, who is a very well-known defense attorney in Salt Lake, and he is who represented Mark Hofmann. And it is Mark Hofmann states that he passed a lie detector test, proving that he did not plant the explosives that killed Kathy Sheets and Steve Christensen. And obviously, he didn't plant the bomb that would try to throw the scent off of himself. And Ron Yangich agreed and said, yes, my client did take a polygraph test, and it shows that he was not lying. So, of course, lie detector tests are not admissible in court. They have fallibility. You can definitely pass a lie detector test. I don't know how skilled Hofmann was in preparing for this test or how sophisticated the tests were back in the 80s, but Hofmann was believable enough to himself and others that he was able to pass this test after just killing two people and blowing himself up. And that is definite delusional behavior, or a delusional mind.
Yeah, go ahead, Clay.
Well, I was just going to say, for a guy who makes his living by deceiving and lying to people, that's evidence that he was good at what he does, right?
Right. Yeah, I actually took a class at the University of Utah when I was an undergrad. It was a psychology class, and it was taught not by one professor. Every week we had a different professor come in and teach about their area of expertise. It was kind of a survey class. And one of the units was on lie detector tests. I don't even know, probably just because this expert happened to be a professor on campus, and so they threw him in there. But he was the guy who administered the test to Hofmann. And he talked to us about that, and he basically said, yeah, he had me fooled. He said sometimes when you give these, they're sort of borderline where it could go either way, but technically they pass. He said that he passed with flying colors. So yeah, he was pretty good at lying, manipulating people. Let's start to get into the church's investigation, because the day of the bombings, before Hofmann had blown himself up, the church went into, not the church, so some of the police investigators went in to interview Hugh Pinnock. And I think that's kind of an interesting story, how that first initial interview went. Either of you want to take a shot at talking about that initial interview?
Well, just off the cuff, one thing that I remember that being funny is that Pinnock essentially tries to play off that he had only met Hofmann once and didn't really know who he was. They mentioned the McClellan papers, or he mentioned the McClellan papers, but he purposefully he's like the McGillicuddy papers,
The McMuffin papers?
Yeah,
What's that?
McLovin, yeah, we were buying the McLovin collection, and
mean, he was very misleading.
He tried to play it off as though it was like, oh, well, this guy just came in passing, something along the lines of making it sound like it was like some kind of loose conversation in a lobby somewhere.
Like an elevator, right? Like,
yeah, just like
he
something.
jumped in my elevator and we talked for 30 seconds or something.
Yeah, just really, really dishonest.
Yeah, and I think I can't remember how they knew that he had talked to
I think it was
Dallin.
they subpoenaed or got some kind of, I think they happened upon some information from from Pinnock's secretary that showed, I think they spoke with her and she's like, oh yeah, Hinckley, he's up here all the time. And then they went back to Pinnock and he's like, oh, maybe I do remember that guy. Yeah, he has been in a
Yeah,
few
you mean
times.
Hoffman, he's been up here all the time, yeah.
Yeah. Hoffman's been up here he's up here all the time.
Yeah, and they were asking about meetings that Hoffman might have had with Dallin H. Oaks, and that's when Pinnock was saying, well, you have to understand that a lot of people come in and they might see Elder Oaks in the hall, and then they actually talk to somebody like me, but then they go tell all their friends that they had a meeting at Elder Oaks' office, but they really didn't. Yeah,
Which is probably very true.
It could be, sure. I'm sure, obviously, I'm sure people lie about their general authority encounters, especially in Utah, as you get a little publicity there.
What is it, the 6 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon or whatever the hell?
Yeah.
It's probably along the lines of that.
But let's set the stage in saying that Christensen was involved in getting documents for the church. Hoffman and Christensen went to the office building. Christensen's family reports numerous times where Christensen was on the phone with Hinckley and had Hinckley in his phone, or, well, not in his phone. This was before,
It was in his Rolodex.
But it was in his Rolodex. That it wasn't uncommon that there would be conversations between Christensen and the office building, presumably Hinckley. So, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's well documented that this was not a casual relationship or business deal.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so in interviews, and then a few days after Hoffman blew himself up, the church actually held a press conference with Hinckley, Oaks, Pinnock, and I guess one of the PR guys. They always have a PR guy to come in and sort of conduct the meeting or whatever. And Hinckley gave a very carefully worded statement. He said something like, to my knowledge, Steve Christensen has been in my office only once. So that was probably 100% true, that Christensen had actually only been in Hinckley's office once. But like you said, Clay, the investigators knew, and either then or they were going to discover as they started going through phone records and things and interviewing other people, that Hinckley and Christensen talked on the phone, I don't know about regularly, but definitely a lot more than once.
Yeah.
I would say several times a month. 3 to 4 times a month, depending on what was going on. There may be a few phone calls in one day, but he was definitely, I'm sure they recognized each other's voices on the phone at this point.
And let's not forget that the church backed a $200,000 loan for Hoffman and Christensen. You don't do that because of a casual elevator conversation or someone passing through your office.
Yeah, I'm going to try that, though. When I'm in Salt Lake next, hey, President Uchtdorf,
how about $200,000?
Yeah, I could use a little something. Have you ever thought about just selecting one random member of the church and just paying off their mortgage just for the heck of it?
God, they should do that every year. That should be Mormon lottery right there.
Well, I think if you get called to be an apostle, you win.
Yeah, but they do something lame like buy you your food storage for a year.
Oh, yeah, I don't want that. I'd have plenty of. If you paid off my mortgage, I'd have all kinds of money to buy food storage. I'd use that mortgage payment or a portion of it to buy rice and wheat.
And powdered eggs.
Yeah, because you got to have your protein. All right, so back to the investigation, and so the church was less than forthcoming in these initial interviews. They were less than forthcoming in the press conference. Another story I thought was interesting is I think when they were trying to set up either a first or second interview with Pinnock, and they were calling the church, I don't know who they were calling, I guess his office, to try and say, yeah, we need to come and interview you again and talk to you about this case. and they were getting church security, basically telling them things like, well, Elder Pinnock is a very busy man.
Or Elder Pinnock is in the temple all
Yes.
day long.
Yes.
Like
Exactly.
someone just like sits, like all day long.
Yeah,
He's having Shavasana in the temple.
Yeah. And so the investigator, there's a million investigators in there, impossible to keep all the names straight. But whoever it was who was making that call, when they got the he's a very busy man or he's in the temple, he basically said, yes, well, I'm conducting a murder investigation, and you can either get him on the phone or make him available, or we can send a subpoena, whichever you want.
Oh, I think I just got the bat phone. He's right here.
Yeah, well, he did call back that guy within 10 minutes or something.
God, it's a miracle. Revelation is true.
And another thing that happened after they talked to Pinnock, I think they interviewed him a couple of times. The first time he gave sort of the, I don't really know anything about this, and this Hofmann guy, he's probably just lying. But then they came in later with, hey, we know about the McClellan collection. We know that you authorized a loan at First Interstate Bank just on your signature alone. We know that wasn't standard practice. So they kind of did I'm not a policeman, and I don't practice criminal law at all, but sort of what you see on TV, the Law and Order type thing, where they go in and with all the evidence they have to basically show the witness, hey, you can't stonewall us anymore. We know this, and this, and we really need some answers. And we expect you to give us some answers. Yeah. So Pinnock gave them some answers, and they said that he broke down and cried. And you do have to feel, bad for the guy. Again, I don't think his motives were bad. I think he was thinking, I'm doing something good for the church. This is I'm fulfilling my calling as a general authority, et cetera, et cetera. But again, one of those cases where you start thinking that the ends justify the means, and you start doing things that are not right.
Is in front of the horse.
Well, and as an apostate, I'll laugh and I'll point fingers at the church and say how unethical they were acting. But let's remember that Hofmann blew 2 people up, murdered 2 people in cold blood. And so
let me piggyback on that, Clay.
Yeah.
And that is, those 2 people would never have been blown up had the church had the keys of Revelation as they allege.
Oh shit, you're just opening a huge conversation right now.
Let's save that. Let's save that to the end, because I think that's
a good point, Amy.
Yeah,
I
definitely a good point. I definitely want to discuss that, but let's table that for the time being, and don't let me weasel out of it, because I'm the lone believer on the panel. So make sure that I come back to that.
You're a lawyer, so that kind of cancels stuff out. So
that cancels everything good out about me.
Yeah.
Other than I always am fighting against the IRS, so I'm not that terrible.
No, you're a good guy.
So they go and interview Hinckley after the second interview with Pinnock, where he broke down and cried, and he basically, from what I can tell in the book, he gave them all the information that he had. But they wanted more information to see how much Hinckley was involved, how much Oakes was involved. They interviewed Hinckley. Hinckley was represented by one of the fine lawyers from Curtin and McConkie. I think it was one of the McConkies. There like 4,000 of them worked there, I think. But he was not as open with his answers as Pinnock was in that second interview, or even as Oakes had been in his interview. He said, for instance, well, I think they were asking him, do you have any daytimer entries where we could see kind of when you had spoken to Hofmann and or Christensen, and so we can kind of piece this together? And Hinckley claimed at that time that he didn't keep a daytimer.
Yeah, he didn't keep a journal. They asked him, knowing that journal writing is such an important part of being a Mormon, they figured, well, hell, he's going to have this information. And he was just like, beat him to the punch. I don't keep a journal, which, hello, Hinckley's told some untruths. That's right up there with, I don't know, we teach that.
No, I mean, it's a huge lie. I mean, the fact that he is essentially running the church, he is a huge name, he's a busy man, and to say that someone is not keeping your schedule somewhere, that is just outright dishonest,
Well, I think, now here's more of my lawyering coming in here. One of the things that I do in my practice area is prepare people for depositions. We're involved in a lot of tax litigation. And when you prepare people for depositions, an interview from the police is sort of like a deposition. You instruct them, you answer the questions that are asked. And so it may very well be that Hinckley's calendar and things were kept by someone else, but I think that the way they phrased the question was, we need to see your daytime or a calendar, and he answered again what I think was technically truthfully, I don't keep a daytimer.
Which opens a huge can of worms that we're going to have to table for later as well. That is my big issue with this. But okay, as a lawyer, what
I don't know that. Look, I'm not excusing. I'm not trying to excuse it. I'm just trying to, again.
But Troy, why don't you talk about the reaction from the investigators that went and interviewed Hinckley?
This is kind of another really interesting tidbit. I think there were 4 detectives that were, at least 4 that were present in the interview with Hinckley, and about half of them were either non-Mormons or Mormons who had sort of, I don't know if they were really apostates, but people that just had, for whatever reason,
they
quit
were less
practicing.
active.
Yeah, they're less active. They didn't care. The church was not really in their life at the time. So I think one of the guys was actually a returned missionary, but as soon as he got home, he pretty much said, this really isn't for me, and he had left the church. So the people that were not Mormons were unhappy with the way the interview went because they knew they'd been stonewalled, but they didn't really, I think they thought, this is according to the book, they were just sort of miffed by it and kind of like, well, we need to either revisit this, we're going to have to do some more investigation, but we just got stonewalled. The LDS attorneys, the book says, were furious, and you can understand why. These guys, for their job, go out and try and put bad guys behind bars, and that's all they're trying to do here is their job. They're not trying to make anybody look bad other than Mark Hofmann, and they want to catch him because they are pretty sure by now that he is the one who killed these people, and they just want the information that they need to do their job. And they would think that you go and interview the president of the church, of your church, of the church you believe to be the true church.
Not the president at the time, but a big...
Well, right. Effectively the president, I think,
the face
inspired, an inspired, led, directly in contact with God type of guy.
Yeah.
A prophet, seer, and revelator.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you would expect him to be, at least to be honest with you. I mean, even if you weren't expecting him to give you any prophecy or revelation, you would expect that the leader of your church would be truthful. And their impression was that he was not. And they were, again, as said in the book, the word is furious. They were just furious that had happened. And it even reminds me of the Christensen family, Mac Christensen, Mr. Mac, the dude who sells 2 pantsuits to the missionaries.
He's going to have to get a whole new inventory with this revelation of business casual missions.
Yeah. He was actually several years after this had happened, the mission president over the visitor center at the Washington, D.C. temple. I can't remember if I mentioned that on an earlier episode or not, but he's still very faithful in the church. But they said even he and his family, when the church was saying, hey, we really didn't know this Steve Christensen guy, we had very little contact with him, they knew that wasn't true, and they were unhappy about that.
Not only did they know that wasn't true, but their son, had just been blown to pieces, and these cops were trying to prosecute the man who did it.
When I read this book, and I actually have owned, and all of us, we've read several different books, but the book that I read was The Mormon Murders, and I've actually had it on my shelf for probably 18 years before I actually read it. When I finally read the book, and I read it in seriously less than a week, so it was so insanely riveting. But I was working for a physical therapy company, and I shared a cubicle with a very, very staunch TBM woman, and during my lunch, I'd sit at my computer and, look at CNN or whatever, and I'd be reading this book, and I was just gasping. I'd come across something and just be absolutely floored at how major a story this was. And I wasn't as much of an apostate as I am now. I was still trying to take respectful at any turn kind of thing, especially since she was my coworker and whatever. But there was a point when I still have a certain, I have compassion for people in general. But as I read this book, I was so dismayed and I remember mentioning this to her, at how many people after, whether it was the investigators, whether it was just people who knew the victims or people reading things in the newspaper about the investigation, whatever. When the truth started to come out, how many people's testimonies were devastated by the lies of Mark Hofmann and by the actions of the church. And I just thought it was so unfair for these people who I'm sure are good, honest, hardworking, sincere. I want to do my best. I want to be a good Mormon. And to have that ripped away from them over money and greed, when it could be something like truth and honesty, they could lose their testimony over. I was so mad about that. Just these people didn't deserve to have that taken away from them in a situation like this. You know, if you're going to lose your testimony, you should earn it. And these people just got screwed. Anyone that followed this and it impacted them personally, and they kind of saw the forest for the trees, I just thought it was so, so sad.
Well, it's definitely not a good deal. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Really, you know, nothing good came of this at all. We're an hour in, and there's still some things we definitely need to cover, and then I want to get back to kind of some of the more philosophical type questions for the end. So Hofmann's finally arrested. Clay, do you want to mention just a few of the pieces of evidence that allowed them to charge him?
Yeah.
And just in general, let's just talk for a few minutes about the things that he messed up on, or the evidence they found that ended up proving or leading to him being indicted.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, like you said, Troy, the ATF guys, like, Hofmann's your man, everything smelled fishy. It looked like Hofmann had done the murders. There was an eyewitness person in the judge building that saw Hofmann leave with a letterman's jacket that Hofmann purportedly always wore.
Yeah, let me stop you on that letterman's jacket. That's another one of the things that just mystifies me. If he was so smart, and we've proven that he was pretty darn smart to do all this stuff, why would you wear the same, if you're sort of identified with this stupid letterman's jacket from Olympus High School that he used to wear?
With no letter or something,
I guess he tore the letter off so that he could still wear the letter jacket and not be completely embarrassed, or I don't really know, but
I think it shows how emotionally immature he was, and how he really lived in an arrested state of emotional development, that he would so closely identify with that letterman jacket to the point of, well, in order for it to be legit, I've got to take the letter off so I can still get away with wearing it. And I'm gonna up it a little bit. I'm gonna bring this letterman jacket into my adult repertoire and pull. You know, that's just, to me, I imagine this kind of pudgy, kind of greasy faced, maybe kind of slightly balding, pigeon-toed, carrying a big gulp, walking around with a backpack full of bomb supplies, and that's Hofmann.
But very, very intellectually brilliant. Maybe not so, but no, absolutely. But everybody, you know, the prosecutors, the investigators, all smelled Hofmann, right? But the problem is that there was no motive for Hofmann to do any of these things. People still were absolutely convinced that his documents were real. A reporter for some like American Antiquities journal showed up to the trial because he was convinced that the Oath of a Freeman was real. You know, like, people really thought that these things were real. And Hofmann, without the conviction of forgery, there really is zero motive for Hofmann to blow these people up, right? So
except for the money.
How would killing these people make him more rich if his documents are real?
No, it would eliminate the need for him to pay them back.
Well, maybe so, but if he really had the McClellan collection, right, and if he was really going to sell it to the church, the charges are more tenuous.
Maybe his stripper habit was bigger than we realized.
Possibly.
I think they always are.
The forgery link was key, right? And forgery gave Hofmann a real motive to really commit these crimes. And so there was an investigator who was suspicious of forgery. All the historians were saying, no, they're real, they're real, they're real. He started to notice some consistencies with the forgeries. One of them that he noticed is the ink seemed to run all in the same direction on Hofmann documents, and there also seemed to be this crackling feature, right? Yeah. And so as they build this case, they invite an expert on documents from Arizona, and he essentially examined hundreds, like 600 documents of Hofmann documents and non-Hofmann documents. And the investigator said, hey, if you see any discrepancies or kind of consistent weird things in these documents, group them together, tell me what you think. And essentially all of Hofmann's documents had two things. One, the ink ran in the same direction, and the ink was crackled. It had this kind of alligator skin type of feature. And
can I add something real quickly?
Please,
Clay?
yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, please.
In some of the research I did, and this was on, it was a peer-reviewed journal article, and I don't have the actual reference information, but at the time of the printing of this article, and I think it was in, I want to say like late 1990s, they had examined the forensic summary of the Hofmann forgeries were, at the time of printing, they had examined 443 documents.
Mm-hmm.
At the time of the investigation thus far, they had determined the abilities of detection for forgeries that 268 of the 443, which is 60%, were determined to be authentic.
Mm-hmm.
At the time of printing. 107 of the 443, which is 24%, were determined to be forged. 15%, 68 documents, were undetermined. At that time, the church acknowledged that they received, either sold or had donated to them, 48 documents from the 443. And I think all of us would agree that it is impossible to determine the number of actual documents that were truly received by the church due to the lack of transparency within the church archival system and the historical research departments. But, they've already revised the number. First, they said they only received 40 documents. And now, since there was an interview and an article done in Sunstone magazine, they've now uncovered that it could be as many as 400 documents, from everything from little tiny things to the big things that we know of. But it goes much deeper than we will ever know.
But what you're talking about, Amy, is all of Hofmann documents, correct?
Yes.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
Have been identified as Hofmann documents. At the time, there were 443 that were being examined to determine these are suspected Hofmann documents. 443 were forensically examined with the examination abilities that they had at the time of the investigation. 60% of them were still deemed authentic.
Yeah. So what I'm talking about with the investigator, so this investigator from Arizona was named William Flynn, and he did a blind study of over 400 documents peppered with Hofmann documents, right? And so some of them were authentic, old style, written in iron glockenate ink, and some of them were Hofmann documents, and all of the Hofmann documents that he examined that were suspected of being forgeries had this crackling of ink, and everything ran to the same direction. And so he thought they were forgeries because they all shared that similarity. The study was done blind, and then he reproduced the effects by using an ink recipe in a book that was found in Hoffman's house called Famous Fakes and Forgeries by Charles Hamilton.
What an idiot!
Yeah, and so he reproduced the effect by, I forget what they added to the iron glockenate recipe that made it crackle like this. And
I think it was probably something like lemon juice or something.
Something weird. And then the running to one direction, if I'm not mistaken, it was from the same hand writing each document that smudged these things in the same direction. Some of the other evidence that they introduced was a woman from California that sold or donated this book that was supposedly it belonged to the Harris family. It was called the Book of Common Prayer. And then later Hofmann acquired it. He put a poem in the front by Martin Harris, which was supposed to be valuable because I guess there's little sampling of actual Martin Harris documents. And they had her testify that, hey, this poem was not in the book when I donated it to the person in Arizona or whatever. But the big thing, or a couple of the big things, were eyewitnesses that saw him leave the judge building with his Letterman jacket. And then huge was an alias that Mark Hofmann used called, he called himself Mike Hansen. Okay. And so they connected this Mike Hansen, Mark Hofmann link. Mike Hansen bought the engraving plates to forge the Oath of a Free Man. Mike Hansen supposedly bought Radio Shack parts that made a mercury switch for these bombs, and they found a receipt in Mark Hofmann's house for such things under the name of Mike Hansen with Mark Hofmann's fingerprint on it. So they established this huge tie between Mike Hansen, which was up to this dirty business, that was actually Mark Hofmann.
Again, here, in addition to wearing the Letterman's jacket in to plant the bomb that he was known for wearing all the time, you know, if you're going to come up with an alias, do you want to use the same one for every incriminating piece of evidence you buy? maybe switch it up a little and go with like Chad Hansen when you buy the bombs, or Joe Hansen when you buy the switch. Yeah. But no, it was Mike Hansen every time that he used an alias.
And Mike Hansen versus Mark Hofmann, like
right.
That's so weak.
And then the fake address that he used for Mike Hansen was like on his street. So wow. Yeah, you at least maybe want to cross state lines with your fake address.
So I mean, the prosecutor's office, their case against Hofmann was pretty damn solid, which, you can get into your lawyer lingo, Troy, here, but
if it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
Well, I mean, so the defense, I guess, in a preliminary hearing, the defense doesn't necessarily know all the evidence that the prosecutor has, right? The preliminary hearing is to see if this is to actually go to trial. Am I correct?
You have to reveal all the evidence you have.
I don't think so in a preliminary hearing, because there were a lot of surprises in there.
Yeah, at a hearing you don't have to. I mean, and it varies by state law, and it also varies between civil and criminal. And I do strictly civil, and in civil trials, well, first of all, there's no preliminary hearings in civil trials, and then when you actually have a trial, you have to undergo this long process before trial called discovery, where you're actually supposed to show the other side everything that you have. So there's no trial by ambush, is what they call it. Yeah, but in an indictment, you don't necessarily have to do that. Now, I think in practice they do that because you want to either get a confession, which is the most rock solid way to convict someone, is to have them plead guilty.
Yeah.
And if behind the scenes you're saying, hey, I have this, just like I was saying before, I've got X, Y, Z, A, B, I've got everything here. We know the dude did it. We can prove it. So we need a confession.
Yeah, but in this case, as of the preliminary hearing, the prosecutors and the attorney, the county attorney office, was not interested in a plea deal.
Right.
The guy that was the head of it had said, hey, this is going to go to trial. We're going to put this guy away. We're going to put him on the death penalty. That's going to be up for grabs. And so there seemed to be a lot of surprises during the preliminary hearing for the defense. The defense walked in confident. They walked out shattered.
They didn't know, for instance, I'm pretty sure that they didn't know about the woman from California that had the Martin Harris.
And they didn't know about the Hansen and Hoffman tie. They didn't know about the alias tie.
Right, yeah. So you're right. Yeah, there were definitely some surprises in the hearing.
So anyway, that's kind of a quick summary of much of the evidence that they had against Mark Hofmann, and also the bomb evidence. There were, like Troy talked about, the ATF guy said, hey, this dude blew himself up, but...
Let's sort of cut to the next phase, and this gets really legally complicated, and nobody wants to be bored with all of this, and I'm also concerned that I might not get it right if I try to explain it in detail. But after a lot of negotiation after this preliminary hearing, both sides, Yangich and his dudes and the county attorney and their dudes, decided that they were going to come up with a plea bargain situation, that a trial, the prosecution was not 100% sure that they were going to be able to convict him, that a lot of their evidence was circumstantial, and they really wanted to go first degree if they were going to have to go through the trouble of having a trial. And then, of course, there's this whole wild card of having to most likely put Gordon B. Hinckley on the witness stand.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that was the big deal, is that they weren't sure that they could get a jury that could view Gordon B. Hinckley's testimony indifferently, and non-biasedly and objectively.
Well, and not only that, the church was doing everything they could to avoid being put in a position to be subpoenaed to testify.
Yeah.
They were putting a lot of pressure on the prosecutors to, let's try and not necessarily make it go away, but let's do as much as we can to avoid dragging the church into a media circus that resulted, whether or not the church would be viewed negatively. They didn't even just want the association of being tied to someone, doing any kind of business with someone that eventually murdered two people. So they were, and it didn't even take much pressure. It was, you want to please if you're a member of the church, and no matter how pissed you are that people are lying, you don't want to embarrass your church. And there was a lot of unspoken understanding that let's try and make this as painless as possible for everybody, including the reputation of the church.
Yeah, and there was also, we should mention that there was also some political stuff that was going on within the county attorney's office or whatever, in that the head guy that was way against plea bargain was on his way out. And
Ted Cannon.
Ted Cannon, and there was a new guy, was on his way in that was more willing to plea than the guy that was on his way out. And so there were a lot of hard feelings within the office, in that some people had busted their balls trying to build this foolproof case against Hofmann, and then he got plead out. But that was, I think that was partially because of the politics of Utah in and of itself, and partially because of the politics within the attorney's office.
So like Amy said, I think pretty much in the interest of all parties, other than maybe the prosecutors who had really worked hard to try and shore this case up, it was decided that it was in the best interest of most of the people to not have a trial. And so the deal they made was that Hofmann would plead guilty to second-degree murder, and that the death penalty was off the table. His sentence would be from 5 years to life, to be decided later at a parole board hearing. But in exchange for that, Hofmann was supposed to allow himself to be interviewed by prosecutors, because there were still a lot of holes in what they were trying to piece together. And they really wanted just to know what the heck really happened. And so he, as part of this deal, he agreed to be interviewed by prosecutors. So that deal was finalized and publicized, and a lot of people were shocked, I think, including the Hofmann family. It points out in the book that his wife, maybe even as of today, believes that he just did that to protect his family's reputation and protect them from having to see their dad be dragged through this long trial and maybe get the death penalty. That I think that his family, definitely at the time, believed that he was still innocent, that this was just a big conspiracy to get him, and he was just doing that to protect his family, and I think in their minds to actually protect the church.
Can I interject right here?
Why, sure you can.
So, Bill Hofmann, Mark Hofmann's dad, believed he was innocent so much, and was such like a old school stalwart, Mormon, that one of the prosecutors sent Bill Hofmann a dialogue article disavowing blood atonement, because Mark Hofmann was not going to get the death penalty, and Mark Hofmann admitted his guilt to the prosecutors. He felt like he needed to send his pops, Mark Hofmann's pops, hey, don't worry, blood atonement was just one of Brigham Young's crazy things, and you don't need to hope that your son dies.
Yeah, I forgot about that. That's right, that happened.
One thing I wanted to add regarding the deal that he made with prosecutors was, during that interview, he was supposed to recount his crimes. However, because he was not charged with any forgery crimes, his attorneys refused to let him answer questions about the forgeries. So he was pretty sketchy. I think that the interview was probably very much of a letdown for prosecutors, because I think he was real squirrely, didn't give a lot of good information about the killings, and his attorneys would not let him discuss any of the forgeries because he had not been charged with them. So, to this day, there's still a lot of holes, because one, he's a liar, and two, no one ever put his feet to the fire on it.
That's kind of the next part of the story here. The deal went south quick. he goes into his first interview, and the detectives were really mad because they're the ones who had done all the work and that had all the questions and were really the ones that were going to be able to ask the best questions. They were excluded from the interview. There were, I guess, the first interview Hofmann showed up for, there were a whole bunch of people from the prosecution side. Yangich walked in and said, yeah, we're not talking to all these people. And he turned around and left with Hofmann. And there were a series of events like that where Hofmann would come in and he'd be elusive on questions, or like you say, Amy, no, we're not going to let him answer any questions about the forgeries because that's not what we're here to talk about. Or it was our understanding that this was going to be over at 4:30 today. I've got another appointment at 5, and at 4:30 we're walking out of here. So the interviews did not go as planned. Now, part of the way this was supposed to work is if Hofmann would have played ball, if he would have come in and confessed everything, explained how he did everything, cooperated, then the prosecution was going to recommend to the parole board that he get out of prison at some point, depending kind of on how much they got out of this. But I think Hofmann and his defense team were anticipating that it was going to be 10-year-ish. Does that sound right? Do you guys remember that they were thinking somewhere along the lines of 10 years in prison?
I personally don't recall a number, but it doesn't sound outrageous.
Yeah, it was definitely like, okay, this deal, I think that the Yangich and his guys thought that they really got a sweetheart of a deal here, because no trial, no possibility whatsoever of the death penalty. And if Hofmann goes in and cooperates, then 10 years or less, he's out of prison, he can carry on with his life. Well, as I just said, the interviews just did not go the way the prosecutors wanted them to. So they prepared a report for the parole board that said he didn't, I don't know if it said he didn't cooperate, but they basically wrote it up as a kind of a brief to throw the book at him, and recommended that he not ever be paroled, that he spend his life in prison.
Essentially, what the interviews revealed was what a cold-hearted bastard Hofmann was. Also, part of that deal was that he had to write like a letter of apology to Christensen family and whatnot.
Yeah.
And I think that letter entailed a sentence saying, "I'm sorry for what happened."
Yeah. Well, he actually had a hearing before the parole board after the prosecution prepared that report recommending he never get out of prison. And this is where the real cold-hearted stuff hit the fan. And I don't know if you can continue to talk about that, Clay or Amy. Either one of you want to talk about some of the things he said in front of the parole board?
I don't have specifics, but I mean, the general feeling that I got was that he was very detached from the whole thing. You know, like they asked about like, well, hey, do you feel bad that Kathy Sheets got blown up, you know? And he's just like, you know, I didn't intend for that to happen. That was kind of a mistake. I don't know why I left it just in the driveway that morning. And hey, do you think you should get out based on what you did? And his whole, again, I'm not a psychotherapist, I'm not a psychologist, but based on the extensive TV shows that I have watched, I mean, the whole thing just screamed psychopathy, you know, like sociopath mentality, that he just had very little emotion and very little remorse, and he was kind of wrapped up in this weird self-glorifying, you know, buzz that he got from how he fooled so many people, I guess.
He is to this day the most successful forger of the 21st century.
Yeah.
He could be the most successful forger of all time, really.
I'm sure he could. And you can't, I mean, when you're someone who's already pretty impressed with themselves, so much so that they think they can pull off a Letterman jacket when they're 40, that's gotta count for something.
Hey, that was back in the 80s. I think a lot of people tried to pull off a Letterman jacket back then.
I know,
you're making me feel bad. I'm gonna have to quit wearing my Letterman jacket around, Amy.
Yeah, but you weren't 40, right? In the 80s?
I am now. No, I'm just kidding. I don't have a Letterman jacket. But the thing that he said in front of the parole board that I think was the worst is, and it goes back a little bit to what you were saying, Clay, is they got out of him that the Sheets bomb, yes, was in fact a decoy bomb, that it was to throw investigators off the scent of the whole Mormon document thing that was going on. And so one of the parole board members asked him, well, if all you were trying to do was throw the police off, if that was just a decoy, did you have to kill anybody? Why couldn't you have just blown that up with no one there and to throw investigators off? And he said something to the effect of, basically, I didn't care. He said, I put it there because my goal was to throw people off, If someone died, I didn't care. It could have been a kid. It could have been a cat. It could have been Mrs. Sheets. I had no concern over what the consequences were when I put that bomb there. I was just trying to achieve my own purposes. And I think he was sort of himself, I think, in front of the parole board and really kind of let his hair down or let his guard down to show what, a miserable, just complete heartless bastard that he was. And
he also tried to make himself appear smarter than he was. Right?
Oh yeah,
Like he tried to convince people that he included some deactivation device in the trigger of the bomb, because these bombs were set off that if you tilted it one way or the other way too much, the mercury switch would blow it up, right? And he tried to say, "Oh, I drilled a hole in the package and had a string to it or a wire to it so I could deactivate it if I wanted to." But the ATF people said, listen, based on what we know, that's bogus. We didn't see any of that. He's trying to make himself appear like he thought about this stuff harder than he actually did.
So at the end of the day, after the interview and after the prosecutor's recommendation, the parole board came back and said, our decision is you're never getting out of here. You're spending the rest of your natural life in prison. You have absolutely no possibility for parole. And that's where he is now. And he will stay there until he dies.
Do you want me to do a quick recap of where they all are now?
Yeah. But the one thing, when you talk about Hofmann, are you going to talk about how he tried to kill himself? And
I wasn't going to get into that. He took an overdose. Wah, wah.
Yeah, well, he did. And then another thing that's kind of interesting and strange is he purposely paralyzed his right hand. That's not in the book. That came out later. There's this other book that's out there called The Poet and the Forger or something, and it's kind of a weird book that I tried to read but didn't get through. But in that book, it notes that he would purposely sleep on his, I think it's his right arm. I think he was right-handed. I can't remember. Whatever his writing hand is, he would sleep on it. He purposely cut the circulation off constantly to that hand until it became disabled. And he didn't say why he did that, but speculation is that he never wanted to be able to provide any kind of writing samples or anything that they would be able to analyze to prove what documents he'd forged or to help prosecutors in any way.
Damn.
He'd be crazy.
Well, I sleep on my arm a lot, and I can't think about sleeping on it enough to wake up not being able to use it. That would bite.
Yeah. I mean, he must have been cramming that thing against the wall all day. I guess when you're on when you're
somewhere.
Yeah, I guess you got to come up with a hobby in there. But
I guess. Yeah,
go ahead and do a quick rundown on the where they are now, as far as we know.
As you just stated, Hofmann is in a maximum security cell at the Utah State Prison, and because of his maximum security status, he actually shares a cell, I believe it's with Dan Lafferty, who was convicted of killing Brenda Lafferty and her daughter.
Yeah, they were the crazy fundamentalists, slit a lot of throats, polygamy, all that stuff.
As a very quick side note, the book Under the Banner of Heaven, if any of you have read that, I actually recommend it to if you haven't. It's another very interesting read. That started, John Krakauer, the author, wanted to write a book about Mark Hofmann, and so he went to the prison to try and talk to Hofmann. It had been several years, probably maybe 20 years since the bombings, and he figured that Hofmann would be willing to talk to him. Hofmann wanted absolutely nothing to do with it, but Lafferty, either Dan or Ron, whichever one his cellmate is, was perfectly happy to talk to Krakauer, and that's how that book came about.
Which it is a great book. It really, truly is. Gary Sheets, husband of Kathy Sheets, who was murdered, he now lives in St. George, where he sells life insurance. He's remarried and has been for 18 years, and at the time that this article was written some years ago, they were planning on going on an LDS mission, an adult mission together. Terry Christensen, the widow of Steve Christensen, lives in Utah with her daughter and 2 sons. Terry Christensen was pregnant with her 3rd child at the time that Steve Christensen was murdered. Hofmann's wife divorced him. She's now a life coach and took back her maiden name. A few of the investigators have either written books or still work in the police department. Ken Farnsworth, who was the detective who investigated the case, now works as the criminal investigator for the Utah Attorney General's office. Robert Stott was a prosecutor, still works as a prosecutor. One of my 6 degrees of separation weirdness is that I'm currently still involved in a lawsuit, a slip and fall lawsuit. I have a torn meniscus and it's a mess, but my first attorney on my case was David Biggs, who's now in private practice, but was a Hofmann prosecutor. Ron Yangich, defense attorney, continues to work as a defense attorney in Salt Lake, very well known. Brent Ashworth, one of the private collectors, still lives in Provo, still collects rare documents. He's now part of the Shakely Nutritional Product multi-level marketing stuff. The Deseret Book Rare Books Department no longer exists. Shannon Flynn, one of the guys that helped try
But we should say that Bench was the guy who was in charge of that before, and then he went to Benchmark Books, right?
Yeah, he started. Yeah, right.
And so I think he's still doing his rare books type of thing, but not under the Deseret umbrella, right?
Right. He has his own benchmark, and I think that it's he and another guy who worked with him in the rare book department at Deseret Book. But the Deseret Book shut it down, so he essentially opened it up under his own name.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, Amy.
No, that's okay. Shannon Flynn, who was the lackey that Hofmann sent to talk to Hinckley at the very beginning of the Salamander negotiations. He lives in Phoenix and he owns a parking lot maintenance business. The Salamander Letter, which was proven to be a forgery, is still held in an LDS church vault. Oath of a Freeman, Hofmann forgery, is held by a New York book dealer named Justin G. Schiller. So they still exist, but they're held privately, and the church still has the Salamander Letter, which I thought was very, very interesting.
I don't know what they would do with it other than hold it, though. They would get criticized for selling it.
Why wouldn't they burn it?
Well, maybe they could donate it to a museum or something, but then I don't know. I don't know what they would do with it. I guess they could burn it.
They should just destroy it. Why keep it?
I don't know.
Anyway, that's that. That's where everyone is.
I'm not going to weasel out, like I said. Let's
talk about implication for the church for those. I mean, good grief, who is still listening to this podcast is all I can say.
How long have we been married?
People.
Not that we haven't done an outstanding job, but
that's a lot of crap to cover. How long we've been? It's not quite 2 hours yet, is it? So, Clay, were you going to direct a specific question at me, or you just wanted me to talk about implications generally? Or
I mean, I think Amy's question is the more interesting one. So let me get rid of my kind of mundane one, and then let Amy come in with the firecrackers like she had. But my biggest issue with this is that Clay Painter, as a relatively naive human being who has been in academia for quite some time, but has worked for some very large corporations and is going to work for a corporation in the future, has noticed a consistent phenomena within corporate America. And that is when large corporations say that they act ethically, what they really mean is that they act legally. Now, I'm not saying that that's good, bad, or anything like that. But the fact of the matter is that lay people like ourselves, we think of ethics and we think of ethical actions and we think of almost, idealistic. I mean, we think of ethics as something kind of above everything else and ethereal. But corporations think of ethics as legality. And that's exactly how the church acted throughout this investigation, is that they asked themselves, what can we get away with legally and what do we do in response? And my question is, if this is the one and only true church of Jesus Christ, led by a prophet that is in communication with Jesus Christ himself, should ethics be defined by the law and what is legal?
I say absolutely not. If you want to toe the line and defend the church as not a corporation, then they have to subscribe to the higher law of honesty and integrity and avoiding the appearance of evil at all costs, and even attempting, what's that one quote? I can't remember who made it. Minimizing the truth or minimizing responsibility.
Sins of omission, right? That was Kimball's entire thing. Sins of commission versus sins of omission.
And it's replete with sins of omission, which I find stomach churning, because they can't have it both ways. They can't say that they acted legally, therefore ethically, if they're not going to subscribe to the laws of a corporation rather than the inspired laws of God, which is that they are the one true church with the only proper authority to speak for him. They can't have it
I
both
agree with you 100%, but when I witness the church in its modern form and the church, over the years, what I see is a body that acts within the boundaries of law, but has no higher ethical standard. Troy, go.
Well, so I'm doubly warped here because I have not, in addition to a law degree, I have a master's degree in accounting. So I had to take a bunch of the same classes that the MBA students at the school had to take, including business ethics. So I've received a formal training in business ethics and legal ethics. That's also required for all lawyers, believe it or not. And one of the things
Do you have a master's degree in divine ethics, sir?
No.
Because that is what should be governing the true church of Jesus Christ.
I'm not disagreeing with that. I just wanted to put a little perspective on any large organization. What we learned in the business ethics class is not so much that, look, there's a right and a wrong, and you just do what's right. End of class, run along, take your test. What you learn is that in any big organization, including the church, that you have a whole bunch of different, what they call stakeholders, people that have something at stake here. And the tendency is to look only at the stakeholders of this case. Again, I'm not justifying anything. I'm just trying to put some perspective on it. That if you look at it from the perspective of the prosecution or the victims, which is what you pretty much always want to do when you're looking at a murder case, then you look at what the church did and say, this is just completely out of line. They shouldn't have done this. But, another thing I learned in my business training is that the big organizations are going to always act in a way to preserve themselves, whether that's legally, ethically, whatever it is. The corporations end up acting a lot like people because they're run by people, and they'll do kind of what people do to survive, and that's not always what on the surface is the most ethical thing. But I think that the leaders of the church were at all times trying to protect the church. I do think they probably overthought this a little too much. I think that I think part of what they were doing is they were nervous to have a lot of the dealings with Hofmann brought out in public, that they were essentially doing kind of behind the scenes dealing with him all the time. The idea that there were documents out there that they might actually be nervous about, so they might be purchasing them to kind of hide them away. They didn't really want that information out there.
That's a perfect segue.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously we can agree that yes, the church is a large organization. People acted as humans. Mistakes were made. Blah 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 blah. One thing, Troy, is I want your next family home evening lesson to be like, hey, there's a lot of stakeholders in this family. So when you're deciding whether or not to lie and blame it on your sister, you got to think, how is this gonna? No, I'm just joking. That's just me BSing and
no.
I don't want to hold your feet to the fire. But here's another thing. So hiding documents. We know that is what the church does and what has done. I guess I don't even have an intelligent question to ask, but good God, how does that reflect on the church? Why is this going on? Why does it continue to go on? Why has it gone on in the past? I mean, if we're abiding by the truth shall set you free type of mentality, this is just ludicrous. And this is just me ranting. Like I said, I can't even formulate these thoughts into coherent, poignant questions, but what utter debauchery. I mean, it's nefarious. That's what it is. It's nefarious.
Outside Proposition 8, which is an entirely different, that to me is just dirty. I think what they did was just dirty. It was deceitful and dirty, and it was morally
repugnant.
Exactly. Outside of that, this incident, to me, in my opinion, is perhaps the number one indicator of the falseness of the modern day church, period. You can't dance around any of these issues and still have the church claim that it is what it is. You can't have modern revelation. You can't have proper authority. You can't have powers of discernment. You can't have revelations. You can't have seers. You can't have any of that because Hofmann occurred, period.
Well, let me address, first of all, if you would ask my great-grandma, the one indicator that would show that the church is not true, she would say when they went to two-piece garments, that she was quite upset about that.
Yeah, well.
That was, so that, getting that out of the way, all I can do is give you my personal opinion, and there's 2 points. Clay brought up, let me address the first one of the hiding documents. Now that's been, again, I can explain why I think it happened, but I don't know that I can justify it, so I'm not really going to try to. And this particular episode of this podcast would definitely not be the first podcast to ever broach the subject of church history and why it is where it is, or why they would want to suppress things. I think that's been discussed elsewhere, and so my only thoughts on that is that it's pretty undeniable that they, at one point, including this period of time, definitely were throwing stuff down the memory hole. But it's a lot less common because they can't do that anymore with the internet, and I think that's one of the reasons that they've got the Joseph Smith Papers project, and they're putting out, at least they're saying that they're putting out all the papers that they have on Joseph Smith, because if they don't do it, then someone will find anything that they might consider damaging anyway, and then it just makes the church look like they've got something to hide. So I think they've learned from the period when they were definitely hiding things or worried about.
Which is disgusting, because there should be no lesson to learn. There should be no lesson.
Well,
there shouldn't be any. It just.
Again, I'm not gonna argue with you on that point. I remember the first time I ever went into the Tanner's bookstore there in Salt Lake, and that might be the first time I ever walked into a bookstore where, and I'm not just talking about the Tanner's written specifically anti-Mormon stuff. They had all kinds of different history books. They had the original version of the Book of Mormon in there. They had both the Book of Commandments and the original version of the Doctrine and Covenants. And I remember just like being overwhelmed with like almost joy of, look at all of this cool actual historical stuff that hasn't been through correlation, that hasn't been sanitized. I have a place where I can actually look at what actually happened and see what the actual history is, to the extent that it's in those books. And I'm excluding the Tanner stuff. That's a different podcast. But I've always been of the opinion that it's just better to let everything out and let the chips fall where they may, as they say. So if you're looking for someone to defend the policy of whatever it was, suppression or sanitizing the story, I'm not the guy for that, or I wouldn't be on this podcast, I don't think. Now, to your point, Amy, I think you were making a larger point, and you hear this a lot when it comes to the Hofmann episode, or whatever you want to call it, is if these guys were really prophets, when Hofmann walked through the door with that Anthon transcript, President Kimball should have picked that up, and the Lord should have said, nope, this is a forgery. Tell this man to leave. Do not buy this. Obviously, that's not what happened.
Yeah,
and,
just to re-articulate, Amy, you said something like, if the church was what it claims, and if these people were who they claim to be, these murders wouldn't have happened. Is that right?
Absolutely, because without the church, Hofmann had no venue. He had no avenue. If the church had not, in their own sense of fear and lack of direction, even from a management standpoint, it's not just that they didn't have any powers of discernment. They were operating from a dishonest place, which was, we need to cover this stuff up. If that had not been the position the church had taken, Hofmann would have had no avenue, no outlet. There wouldn't have been the demand. There wouldn't have been the motivation. There wouldn't have been the money, the greed, all of that stuff. These people would still be alive had the church not basically breastfed Hofmann.
oh boy.
Can I play devil's advocate for a second? I mean, I think you raise a good point, and it definitely fostered a culture and an environment for Hofmann to thrive. Having said that, I mean, Hofmann was involved in Charles Dickens, in Oath of a Free Man. Who's to say other people wouldn't have died had Hofmann produced the Thomas Jefferson collection or something like that? I don't know that would have happened, but for me, just kind of from a gut reaction, I have a hard time saying that the church is completely to blame for their murderous actions Well, I know you're not saying they're completely to blame, but I'm saying that
They are co-conspirators.
well, yeah,
Uh,
I guess even from a heretical view, I have a hard time coming down hard on that line, I guess. I don't
Oh,
know
I have
why.
no problem. Nope.
well,
And that's
yeah,
great. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying that I'm not necessarily seeing it from your perspective quite yet.
I'm not going to accuse the church of being a co-conspirator to murder because I don't. They didn't sit down with Hoffman and say, "Look, these people have to die in order for."
They drove the freaking getaway car. You don't have to know what's going to happen when someone goes in to rob a liquor store. They were part of this entire. They helped it grow. They, like I said, they breastfed Hoffman into this
Well,
position.
I don't disagree with you when you say without the church or without their sort of culture of we've got to buy these documents before people that are our enemies get a hold of them. Culture fed what Hoffman was trying to do, but I'm not going to go as far as to say even compare them to the getaway car. I think the church had absolutely no knowledge that Hoffman was going to kill anybody.
You know what, though? That just proves how effed up they are because I thought they were supposed to be revelators and have prophecy. To even say the church didn't know. Okay, well, that doesn't make it any better because they were supposed to know.
Well, and from the believer's perspective, I mean, this Hoffman thing has never bothered me in that way where I thought, geez, these guys are not prophets because they should have been able to discern all this crap that Hoffman was pulling on them, and they should have just told them to go pound sand from day one, and then none of this would have happened. I think I've mentioned before on other episodes that agree with my philosophy or not. My philosophy is that the Lord uses men and imperfect people, and he kind of puts the people he has in place, and they do the best they can, and they don't always do everything right. They don't always discern things like this. And remember from way back in the first episode, back in the late 70s or whenever it was, we recorded the first episode here. We talked about how Hoffman was able to accomplish this, and that was by producing documents initially that were very favorable to the church. The Anthon transcript, that when that came through the door, President Kimball and the other guys that are in that picture that you see, they all thought this was about the greatest thing that had ever happened because this was proving the authenticity of the Book of Mormon.
Whoa! How does the Anthon transcript prove the authenticity of the Book of Mormon?
Oh, I'm not saying that they're right. I'm just saying that they maybe not proved. Maybe I went too strong with proving, but I think in their mind they thought this was
Confirmation.
at least proof that the Martin Harris story was accurate.
Maybe, but the symbols produced within this supposed Anthon transcript were anything but Reformed Egyptian. If Reformed Egyptian was really a language at all, you know.
But they thought it was, and they believed their own hype. They're like, yes, we finally have a copy of what this is supposed to look like.
I understand.
That's the point I'm trying to make, I guess, is that when that came through the door,
it was hope for them. It was like, hey, wait.
Yeah, they weren't as skeptical as probably they should have been. They
wanted
so badly for this thing to be authentic that I think that those feelings and emotions got in the way. And especially with President Kimball, he was one who 100% believed that the American Indians were the Lamanites. He's the one who put they actually called it the Lamanite placement program. I don't know if either Amy might be old enough to remember this.
My mother had an Indian sister. Kimball is the one who said that those that were placed in the placement program could be seen as a few shades lighter because they could see that the curse of the Lamanites was reducing.
So Kimball's, he's obviously a literal believer here when it comes to the Book of Mormon and the Lamanites and everything. And so he was sort of the perfect mark when the Anthon transcript came through the door of, hey, more evidence that this is all 100% true, and I believe it to be true, and now we can show the world here's more evidence that our story is authentic, and maybe let those feelings get in the way of what kind of discernment or skepticism that he had. And then, as we all know, the church is such a top-heavy organization. If the prophet's on board with something, then who underneath him is going to challenge it to say, hey, President Kimball, let's do some authentication on this. Let's really run this thing through the ringer just to make sure that it's not a forgery, because if it is, it's going to come back and bite us, and we don't want that to happen. I don't think really anybody stood up and did that. And so the church was in a position early to trust Hofmann, to think, boy, this guy's bringing in some great stuff. And then he turned the tables on them by starting to bring in some not so great stuff, but that he already had established this credibility. And so, I mean, I blame Hofmann for all of this stuff. He knew what he was doing. It was very deceitful, but I'm not going to disagree that the climate of let's run Leonard Arrington out of town and cancel the publication of the 16-volume history of the church and buy documents that we think might be unfavorable so we can put them in the vault, definitely that created a climate that allowed Hofmann to do what he did.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point to make, is that even though Hofmann, I agree with you, Troy, that I blame Hofmann for the people who died. I put the sole blame on Hofmann personally.
Yeah, me too.
Having said that, even though the church bought Hofmann documents that were forged and hid them, the church has bought and continues to buy many authentic documents and continues to hide them. So that culture that facilitates that continues to exist and existed well before Hofmann, I guess is.
And what that proves is they haven't learned their lesson, which is this operating in a state of secrecy and continuing to create the public persona of what the modern church is. Mm-hmm. It is a production. The fact that they would be so excited to snatch up the Anthon transcript because it proves what they believe to be true. In my opinion, it's just a move of desperation. It's motivated out of desperation, because if it were true, they wouldn't need the Anthon transcript to prove anything.
Yeah, I don't know that was. I think my words were poorly chosen when I said that. I think they were just excited that it was.
No, Dallin Oaks said so much. I mean, I could Google we could go back to our notes. This was their Rosetta Stone.
Well, okay. If he said it, then you can blame him. I didn't want you to be attributing.
No, I don't attribute bad choice. Anything. No, Troy.
Okay. And we need to wrap up. This has gone on for so long. But this one question for Clay, I'm not aware of kind of continuing documents that are being purchased and hid. But maybe I just haven't paid that much attention to it. But I'm not.
Well, so I'm shooting off the cuff here, okay? Mm-hmm. But maybe 6 years ago, I remember an article in the Tribune, and there was this big hubbub, and I don't remember the guy's name, but it was kind of a right-hand man to Brigham Young, and I want to say he had like a Les Miserables name, like Jean Valjean or something like that. His diaries were supposedly bought by a private collector, hopefully to be, I guess they were written in some weird-ass shorthand back in the day, but they were waiting to be translated. Translated is a poor word, but
maybe it was in the Deseret. Maybe it was in the Deseret alphabet.
Well, I don't think it was that so much, but it was like some antiquated shorthand script or whatever. But, this was supposed to be a big deal, and multiple people wrote about it. And what's his name that wrote Blood of the Prophets wrote about it and all this stuff. And, I'm not saying that the church has snatched that up, so I don't have direct evidence, Troy. I guess what I'm saying is circumstantial, but we have not heard of anything about it since. And again, I want to qualify my statement. I don't know that the church bought those. I don't know that they hid them away. But I don't know. I mean,
that's what you.
I guess it's naive for us to think, because the Hofmann experience took place, that all of a sudden the church has lost interest in antique manuscripts from Mormon memorabilia, and we do know this. We do know this, Troy, that post Arrington, the archives have become tremendously more locked down. So I can say definitively that even if the church isn't buying up manuscripts and hiding them, they sure as hell are not allowing access to the manuscripts that they have.
Well, that's what you get for reading the Tribune. You need to stick with the church's organ.
Oh, God!
You read the church's organ, they'll give you the straight story on
Straight
stuff
and
like this.
sure.
Oh boy!
All right.
I didn't even mean to do that. No, look, I'm not a fan of suppressing history. So
I'll post links to this whole journals that were purchased, and if people have information about it, I would love to hear about up-to-date information or whatever. So
the only response to that is what I said a little earlier. I don't think this has much to do with Hofmann at all. I think it has a heck of a lot to do with the internet, though, and the church is finally realizing that people can get whatever they want on the internet. Any kind of historical documents or more information about church history that isn't maybe completely in line with the correlated sanitized version, rather than just leaving that out there and not saying anything about it. They've done this Joseph Smith Papers project that was big at first, but I think people are, I don't know how many people are going through the Joseph Smith Papers with a fine-tooth comb. You don't hear much about it as you used to. I think they're being more open, though, and in fact, it's my understanding that they're coming out with new seminary manuals, maybe even gospel doctrine manuals. I don't know for sure, but I know for sure seminary manuals, maybe it's seminary and institute manuals, that are supposed to be a little more open about history and that are supposed to be addressing some of these issues that people are surprised by because the church largely has not said much about them. But we'll see, I'm not a fan of suppressing history. It's always better for me and more exciting for me and more fulfilling for me to have access to all stories from all viewpoints and then make my own conclusions.
But we're a fan of you, Troy.
Well, thanks.
That's what makes you so awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that and that I have the strength of 10 men.
Well, there you go. Well, we can call this chapter complete. This Mark Hofmann with the trilogy ends.
Finally. And episode 3 was a mighty long epic that probably requires several intermissions.
Yeah, kudos to anybody who listened to the entire thing, man.
If you're still with us, congratulations. But we appreciate everyone listening, appreciate Amy and Clay for all the work and research they put in to this series of episodes, and for Brant and I think Heather's recorded some and edited some of the episodes, and everybody with the Mormon Expositor group for putting this all together. Thanks for listening. Check out our webpage. Throw us a couple bucks to keep current equipment and such. And anything else before we sign off?
No, thanks for listening.
I've been wanting to do Hofmann since back when I was paneling for Mormon Expression, and this has been an awesome opportunity, and I couldn't have been happier than being on this panel with you guys.
Well, feelings mutual all around. I'm sure it was. I think everybody did a lot of work and research on this, and it's of course a very interesting subject. So thank you. Thanks for listening. Check out the website. Leave us some comments, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, guys.
Good night, everyone.
When I gave my heart to you, I swore it would only be for you. But I said that before you broke my heart. When the feelings you feel of you, I can't share mine with you. The lump of pain in my throat won't let me start, and I wish that I didn't ignore. The broken hearts get broken more. Sometimes in our lives we learn things done come back in turn. What did I do to earn nothing from you in life? The mistakes I've had don't do me any bad till I can't handle sad things I've been through. I can learn from mistakes and from sins, but I make them again and again. Above the oceans of tears that I've cried, to look down on myself and ask why. For you I won't change me again. It's hard enough that I am who I am. There's so many people who haven't walked a pleasure ride. I wonder which side of me they would be. I smile to hide all my fears, but still I can't hold back the tears. Oh, I wanna fly to lose myself up in the skies, so that rain doesn't come from my eyes, and I can't hide behind all these lies. It's time to remove my disguise. There's so much of me I've missed, trying to get that kiss. She said, wear clothes like this. I said, okay. I've been stomped in the ground, molded and twisted round, so long before I found I'm not just clay. I'm worried what others might see, instead of seeking approval from me. I wanna fly so fast that my past passes by, to erase all my past one last tries. If it's true that I'm such a great guy, why can't I look me in the eyes? I want to begin to think of me the way that I am, to forget all the people I've been. I've figured out reasons for why. Now I'll just give me one